A broken heart led her to fake a hug with a stranger. What she didn't know was that he wasn't just any man. He was the billionaire everyone in the city whispered about. Madison Blake had only meant to be invisible. The hotel lobby smelled of perfume and polished brass. Chandeliers scattered light across marble floors that reflected 100 polite smiles. She'd made a rule for nights like this. Show up, place the gift, leave. Her thrift store cocktail dress pinched at the toes, and she was counting the minutes until she could crawl back to something ordinary, to cheap coffee, to a couch that knew her shape. But then she saw him. Or rather, she saw them. Her ex, arm in arm with a new fiancé who wore the sort of polish Madison had once dreamed of but never learned how to keep. Ryan's smile was the same half-smirk that used to make her think she was seen. Now it tightened something in her chest so hard she could taste copper. She felt small in the midst of shimmer, suddenly every pretense she'd built folding inward. She moved before her mind could catch up. It was the sort of tiny rebellion that comes from being cornered, a quick, desperate thing. She dropped her purse, crossed the glinting floor, and wrapped herself around the nearest stranger as if he were the only solid thing in the room. He went still like someone who didn't know how to be hugged, then slowly returned the embrace with steadiness, an arm firm and warm at her back. His voice, low and amused, brushed her ear. "Should I be worried?" he asked. She heard Ryan pass behind them. She whispered, urgent, "Just go with it." For a second, humiliation and relief braided into the same pulse. The stranger didn't let go. If anything, his hold tightened with polite insistence. "You okay?" he murmured. "I will be," she managed, breathless. She looked up and found a face that did not belong to the glossy crowd. He had a clean, sharp jaw, dark hair that fell in easy waves, warm hazel eyes that watched her like someone cataloging a rare thing without wanting to disturb it. He smiled, small and almost embarrassed at being hugged by a stranger. "I've never been hugged like that at a wedding," he said, and she laughed despite herself, a startled, fragile sound that turned into something softer when he offered to buy her a drink. That tiny promise, that ordinary courtesy, felt like an unexpected lifeline. They sat in a tucked-away bar, amber light leaking into low corners. Madison ordered red wine that tasted like courage and lies. He took whiskey, neat. Conversations skated around the easy things, the absurdity of overpriced floral arrangements, the theater of family events, the way people politely pretended not to listen while actually cataloging everyone like specimens. He asked no probing questions about the looks she'd just endured. He accepted her answer about the ex with a quiet nod, the kind of listening that makes you feel like the messy bits of your life are allowed to exist without being rearranged into a spectacle. By the time they left, the polished facade of the reception room felt far away, a theater curtain pulled between what had happened and what might follow. The next morning, sunlight filtered through Madison's blinds and painted a pale arc across her kitchen table where an untouched cup of coffee sat cooling beside an open laptop. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You left your courage on the floor last night. Thought I should return it." Her pulse sped. There was only one person it could be. Her thumb trembled as she typed back, almost before she thought. "Where should I meet you?" The reply was almost immediate. Blue Harbor Bookshop. Poetry aisle. The bookshop smelled of dust and paper and a kind of quiet that felt like home. He was there, seated on the floor between tall, narrow shelves, a worn copy of Robert Frost open in his lap. He didn't stand theatrically when she entered. Instead, he shut the book with a soft thump and said, simply, "You came." Their 2 hours among the stacks unraveled without effort. They traded favorite authors like secrets, fingertips brushing spines of novels as if reading could be a kind of touch. When he handed her a tattered book of poems, Pablo Neruda tipped with a bookmark and asked her to read aloud. The air in the aisle turned warmer, heavier. The line he told her to read landed in her chest. "I love you without knowing how or when or from where." She closed the book as if it might catch fire. In those pages and between those sentences, something tender and unguarded began to take root. After the bookshop, a cafe. After the cafe, laughter that felt less rehearsed and more like discovery. He did not arrive in a helicopter. He arrived patient and present, The sort of man who could sit cross-legged on a shop floor and make earnest jokes about wedding etiquette. For Madison, it was like meeting someone who'd slipped off the glossy magazine page to stand beside her at the checkout line. Ethan's voice, warm and unshowy, made space for her to say things she hadn't said aloud in years. She spoke of the book she'd wanted to write, of shifts lost to bills and second jobs. He listened like someone who believed words could both break and mend. But late that afternoon, the world edged back in. While they sat in a sunlit corner booth, Ethan's phone flashed with a name she didn't recognize, short, formal, followed by a string of numbers. It reflected on the screen for a beat, and then he flipped the phone face down with a tiny, almost involuntary motion. He offered a smile and said, "It can wait," but Madison had caught the flicker. Something in his expression closed, just for a second. It was like seeing a curtain twitch in a room you thought you were alone in, a small thing that told her the world she was stepping into might be larger and colder than she'd imagined. Curiosity does what coyness cannot. That evening she sat on her bed with the glow of her laptop and typed written nerves. She typed his full name into the search bar, Ethan Cole. The results are loaded with the cold efficiency of the internet. There he was in high-contrast portraits for business magazines, suits, handshakes, speeches beneath glass skyscrapers. Headlines called him a visionary, an industry disruptor. Sidebars listed figures that felt unreal, billions, board seats, political photos. Madison closed the laptop and leaned back against the headboard with a breath that tasted like vertigo. The man who'd sat cross-legged reading Neruda in a bookshop was also a presence that could move markets. The image on the page did not match the quiet man who'd shared poems and coffee, and it made her chest ache with 1,000 small questions. She did not text him in panic or in accusation. Instead, the next morning, a small, almost tender message blinked into her phone. A photograph of the bookstore floor they'd occupied, and a note, "Picked up a few from your list. If you won't write your own stories yet, I'll read the ones you love." It was not a public spectacle. It was not a billboard. It was particular and oddly intimate, and for reasons she couldn't name, that frightened her more than any headline. The next day, he appeared at her door carrying a brown paper bag with 3 books she'd mentioned. "I started these," he said, "but I want to finish them with you." No flash, no showy gesture, a small, careful offer that made the world feel softer. They met again on a rooftop as the day leaned toward evening, city glass glowing like distant stars. She was in her hoodie and messy bun, his sleeves rolled up, leaning against the railing like a man figuring out how to be ordinary. He told her, simply, that he often wished for a day without cameras, without expectation. She told him she'd been unmoored by people who left when she couldn't give them what they wanted. When he said, softly, "I've been followed my whole life, but rarely chosen," the words hung between them, heavy and honest. For a moment, the city dropped away, and only the two of them remained, letting guardrails down. There was nothing dramatic about their next week. A poetry reading, stray jokes, and an easy reluctance to define what was happening. Then, one night after a downtown reading, a sleek black SUV rolled up at the curb, a window slid down, and a man in a dark suit called his name, "Mr. Cole, emergency board call." The formal sound of it made something in Madison's ribs contract. Ethan's posture shifted in that small, invisible way people do when a private thing is asked to hold public weight. He turned to her, voice softer than she'd heard, "I'll call you right after." He left with the same quiet decisiveness he'd shown on the rooftop, and she watched the vehicle merge into traffic and disappear. The city sounds around her, the rumble of tires, the distant laughter in cafes seemed amplified by the space he'd left behind. The next 3 days stretched out with small silences that hit harder than any argument. Her phone remained mostly quiet. She tried not to let herself check it, but curiosity is a tender kind of ache. When a message finally came to Ethan, "I should have explained earlier. Can we talk?" She stared at the screen until the letters blurred. She typed and deleted replies, then typed again. "Madison, I don't know if I can do this. I'm not like the women in your world." The reply arrived almost instantly, "Madison, that's exactly why I'm still here." Her chest tightened between fear and a curious, dangerous kind of hope. That night, she opened the folder she'd carried for years, the half-written novel she'd shelved when life got practical. She read the first line aloud and didn't cry. Not because she was healed, but because something inside her had started to shift. Maybe the shift was small. Maybe it was enormous. Either way, it had begun. When she sat on her couch that evening and recorded a voice message she would never send as a draft, her voice shook in honest, unguarded ways. "You scare me, Ethan," she said into the quiet, "because I've never been loved without conditions. I don't want your money. I don't want a fairy tale. I want the man who held me when I panicked, the man who noticed the things I loved." She hit send with a trembling finger and then, to her own surprise, smiled through the tears. 2 days later, she walked into the landlord's office with a small personal loan tucked in her pocket and a resolve she hadn't felt in years. She signed a lease in her own name for a tiny storefront next to the Blue Harbor bookshop. She did not take the easy option. She did not accept a rescue that would let the dream bear another's name. She wanted to earn this, to make it hers. Her footsteps later led her back to the rooftop where they'd shared coffee and quietly absurd little confessions. She set a small ceramic figurine between them, the one he'd sent after her voice message, a little bookstore with a chipped awning. She placed the lease into his hands and said softly, without fanfare, "I needed it to be mine before I could be yours." His throat tightened in a way that was not about arrogance but about relief, and he said what she already hoped for, "I didn't want to save you. I wanted to see you." They did not promise headlines or gala photos. They chose something quieter, mornings with coffee and shelves being filled by hands that loved the work. Madison's bookstore opened 6 months later with a wooden sign that read the first page, and it glowed every evening with a warm amber light that felt like an invitation. People drifted in, students, local writers, neighbors, and the shop became a place where private stories were read aloud and strangers became familiar. But that is the echo of what comes after. Right now, on the edge of what's just begun, there is still the question that keeps pulling at the story. Will love, fragile as a paper bookmark, survive the weight of a world that measures people by the size of their accounts and the prestige of their names? Part 2 will pick up the moment that question tightens into something almost unbearable.